Welcome to making one step in school postvention easier, creating a memorial committee. Hello, I'm Maureen Underwood. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I began my work in youth suicide prevention in the early 1980s. My first postvention response was in 1987 to a cluster of suicides in a New Jersey high school where 4 students died at the same time. The response that was developed to deal with that situation formed the basis for the CDC guidelines on managing and containing suicide clusters. I'm also the main author of the Lifelines Suicide Prevention Trilogy, and I've had the opportunity to provide postvention services in hundreds of schools around the country. The reason that this topic is important reflects the fact that administrative sanctioning of memorials after a death in a school community can be one of the most contentious and challenging postvention decisions, especially when there seems to be pressure from multiple directions or the memorials seem to appear out of nowhere. School administrators can find themselves in a place of uninformed decision-making that often becomes codified into precedent. And that's a lot of pressure. This short tutorial is designed to not only make those decisions just a little bit easier, but also to share some of that administrative burden through the proactive creation of a memorial committee. This is a committee that's going to be educated on how to act in accordance with trauma-informed standards and best practice knowledge in suicide prevention. So listen in. Let's start by addressing a question that comes up all the time. Isn't the school the best place for a memorial since the student was a member of that community? And yes, it might seem that way because for many students, memorials can help them feel support in honoring the deceased in a way that reflects their shared grief over the loss. What we sometimes forget, however, is that not everyone in a school is usually affected by a death. Some students might not even have known the deceased, so they have no need to be involved in the grieving process. This is one of the difficulties in creating memorial guidelines. You want to help the process of grief for those who are affected, but not stigmatize those who are unaffected. And what we often get lost in is the fact that the student was a member of a larger community outside the school, which is generally the more appropriate site for permanent memorials. Let's clarify that word, though, permanent memorials, for a second. There's 2 kinds of memorials that we often talk about: spontaneous memorials, which are often created by students immediately upon notification of the death, and they tend to have a short lifespan. These are often managed by your school's crisis team. Those permanent memorials may also be requested immediately, but they're designed to last in perpetuity, and those are usually the purview of that memorial committee. So what we're going to cover is going to talk a little bit about what some of the theory base is, the underpinning for those decisions about school-based memorials. We'll look at the reasons for creating a specific committee to address those memorial requests, as well as kind of briefly outline the structure and the function of that committee. And finally, we're going to just look at some examples of acceptable and unacceptable memorial activities. The framework that we're going to use for this is what we call a competent school community. And basically what that means is that in your school, everyone cares about the welfare of each other and knows where and how to get help if a member of the community is in need. And what I hope you can hear in that is this something that addresses the collective good, not an individual student or member of the community, but that collective good. And this is what's going to form the foundation for some of the theories we want to call to your attention that really underscore some of the best practice in postvention. These theory bases include trauma-informed schools, postvention theory, grief theory, and contagion theory. Now, we're not going to go into these in any details, but I just wanted to put them out there for you so you know that what we're talking about really is based not just on anecdotal evidence, but has some theory base. We do know, however, that there are some limits in what postvention grief and contagion theory can suggest, because there's really a lack of definitive research that talks about the impact of memorials per se from those theoretical perspectives. That's why we include what we know from trauma-informed practices, because that's where it tells us about some of the dangers that may be in some memorial practices that can lead to re-traumatization. And we're going to touch on these when we talk a little bit about the suggestions for specific memorials a little later on. Because responding to memorial requests can be tricky, we've found that one of the simplest and the most inclusive ways to consider dealing with this is through creation of that memorial committee. What it does is includes the voices and perspectives of all members of that competent school community. And in a couple of slides, we're going to list who those members essentially are. This takes some of that immediate pressure from school administrators who have a lot going on when there's a postvention situation. It also provides that opportunity to create some practices that are trauma-informed and best practices and get some board approval for those. It also recognizes that there's a risk of encouraging those clusters, that contagion, or those copycats, if anything is done that glamorizes or sensationalizes the death. And it also recognizes the fact that research tells us that vulnerable students in your school may be triggered by the exposure to a death of a peer under any circumstances. So that's why we need to have a policy that's very consistent, regardless of the circumstance of the death. And as importantly, there is a delicate balance between doing too little and doing too much. And a committee is able to consider that balance when it makes some of those decisions about memorials proactively, using the principles that are essential to crisis intervention and all postvention activities, which is providing support, control, and structure. The other thing about this is that when you have a plan that's in place proactively, you can communicate it to all members of your school community ahead of time so that you can avoid or minimize some of those potential misunderstandings in the event of a death. And that plan ahead of time also is going to free up some time and energy from what are always unexpected postvention complications. So that committee membership, as I just talked about a little bit before, you want an administrator or their designee who has some decision-making authority. You'd like to have a board member because there's nothing better than having an informed board member who acts as an advocate or a champion for what you're doing in postvention. A faculty member and a staff member, both of whom would preferably you'd like to have some good student engagement, because you may need them to help translate some of the guidelines in a way that encourages student buy-in. A PTO member is helpful, as well as a student in a high school in particular who's a member of a student council or some other leadership position. And finally, a community member who has lived experience if possible. And what that means is that they've had some exposure to a traumatic loss. What happens at this committee is that you're going to give them some orientation about memorial guidelines that really are going to reinforce that welfare of that collective, that competent school community, and some of the dangers of re-traumatization and potential copycat behavior. They're going to have a meeting schedule that's very, very limited once they're established, maybe once or twice in an academic year, depending on the need. And they're going to have the authority to present to the board some of their suggestions about what anticipated postvention issues and challenges might be. Let's look just very, very briefly at what some of those memorial activities are that a school might want to consider. First of all, we would like you to think ahead of time about the areas in the school that you might select for spontaneous memorials with very clear timelines for how long they'll be there. So for example, if it's a locker that you choose, you might put a notice on it that says, "We'll leave your tributes to Jimmy here until his funeral, after which time we're going to collect them and give them to his family." You'd like to provide materials for students to write personal remembrances to the family in the guidance office or the library. You also want to be doing some thinking of you messages to the family. Remember, just because their student is deceased does not mean they're no longer a member of that competent school community. And remembering them at periodic intervals goes a long way to really ensuring that they know you appreciate and you honor the memory of their deceased child. You may want to create some hallway messages that spread hope. And in general, the committee is going to support these types of activities, but they're usually going to be carried out by the members of your school crisis team. Other activities might include buying books from the school library that highlight resilience, or maybe they were favorites of the deceased, making donations to causes the deceased supported, collaborating with community agencies and other groups to co-sponsor events, usually in the community, that promote good mental health, or naming a scholarship for equality of the deceased, their good sportsmanship, their kindness, their academics, that they were a team player, something like that. The activities that you want to stay away from is we really discourage holding any of those large memorial activities on school grounds. Remember that larger community is often the place for those. Flying the flag at half-staff, putting a notice outside on the school marquee, or creating wearing apparel, sports uniform decorations that reference the deceased. Planting trees or gardens can be problematic because they, again, are often reminders of not the life of the deceased, but the death of the deceased. Putting plaques or displays in school corridors that list all of the deceased students, naming rooms or sports venues after the deceased, dedicating yearbooks, dances, or sporting events, and then holding those anniversary remembrances on campus. Another issue that comes up that can be often very problematic are yearbooks and graduation ceremonies. So let's give you just a few recommendations for those. We really suggest that you follow your formula for yearbook pictures. You include the deceased with their school accomplishments, but not the cause of the death. You follow whatever is your standard policy for parent guardian purchase of those personal tribute pages. You don't leave an empty seat for the deceased in your graduation ceremony. It's hard for students who sit on either side of that empty chair to concentrate on their own accomplishments or celebrate graduation. So we suggest instead that you offer to host a private ceremony for the parents to present the diploma, and also consider inviting those peers who are close to the deceased to a small group meeting that's hosted by a counselor to discuss personal remembrances of their deceased peer. And maybe in your graduation program, you list all of the students who started the academic journey with the class, and that would be 9th through 12th grade, not K through 12, but 9th through 12 or whatever your high school years are, for example, and include those who change schools, the deceased students as well, and just indicate that you remember those who started our academic journey with us and are not here today. At the end of the day, some key memorial principles are really the fact that you have those spontaneous memorials in designated locations with a time limit that's specified for them. Permanent memorials are much better placed in the community, and candlelight vigils are also really best located at community vigils. Funerals that are held in school locations can create trauma reminders in those locations. For example, the gym, cafeteria. Sometimes you have to do that, but we're just suggesting that that can be problematic for some students and faculty members. You need to have the same procedures for all deaths to avoid the appearance of favoritism or discrimination. And regarding those t-shirts or that clothing that often gets created in memory of the deceased, consider creating a dress code stipulation that really talks about not allowing clothing with images of current or former students. That can address the trauma reminders, not just for students, but for faculty as well. And finally, As you all know, even the best outlined plans may be challenged by resources or circumstances. Keep the focus of the needs on that entire population of living students, that collective, rather than on just the cohort that surrounded the deceased. Knowing that you may upset some schools' constituents and you want to be prepared for that and be sympathetic to that. Remember that contagion clusters and copycat suicides are real and they can follow a death under any circumstances, not just a death by suicide. And that one of the things that can be really helpful is to reach out to close friends of the deceased prior to that death anniversary and help them focus on the ways in which the deceased has impacted their lives. This can be a really positive form of remembering and healing for them. At the end of the day, I guess what we want to say is to remind you that in times of great emotion, especially, we need each other. We need each other to get through because it truly is in the shelter of each other that we live. We want to thank you for listening and thank you for caring about our kids.